Hello and welcome to the ILC Home and Commercial webinar series looking at environmental and agricultural claims. I'm Alan Souter, I'm the chair of ILC's Home and Commercial arm. So firstly, let me have a big thanks to our sponsors today. Our main sponsors, platinum sponsors, are Questgate, who of course hold massive expertise in this area, and I'm absolutely delighted that Chris Hall and his team have decided to back us with this. It really helps get these particular types of seminar out to as many people as possible. Also to our silver sponsors, RSK Raw, and a big thanks to Neil Stothert and his team as well. In this series, we're going to be taking a look at all aspects of environmental and agricultural claims, the risks, the exposures, the use and timeliness of experts, and of course, all the legal and regulatory aspects which can come into play. So let's get on with today's webinar. Hi, in today's second webinar in this series, we're going to be taking a look at the changing face of environmental claims. We're going to take a look at what's happened in the last 10 years and kind of from there how the industry's reacted and moving forward. I was delighted to say we have four very important and advanced thinking people in this industry joining us today. First of all, Alan Shaw is lead underwriter in environmental at RSA Insurance. Welcome, Alan. Aidan Thompson from Bryan Cave, Leighton and Paisner, he's a partner. Richard Lawrence, who's with us from Questgate, Technical and Complex Loss Director Environmental, and Neil Stothert, the Manager Director of RSK Raw. So that's quite a broad spectrum of views. Whatever anybody says here, obviously it's their own opinion, but I think it's a good basis for discussion in an area that in the industry we know is becoming more and more important. So let's start with Alan, shall we? Alan, looking at this webinar, and we're going to take a look at the changing face. What has changed in the last 10 years? And what do you think, what most has impacted environmental claims?
I would say one of the biggest changes in the environmental insurance market in the last 10 years has been the move from environmental insurance focusing on purely transactional opportunities, so people buying and selling land and property or businesses, to offering more operational policies. And I think that has probably impacted the claims side more significantly than the others, because as you're insuring operational, there's going to be increased number of incidents. So therefore, the whole market has more experience in understanding and dealing with the incidents. And that's been across the board to the loss adjusters, the claims teams, the underwriters, and the environmental lawyers. And that results in better outcomes for our clients and better outcomes for mitigating any pollution exposure. And I would really point out, in particular, the number of specialist environmental loss adjusters has been important, because they're the primary responders, and what they do matters in mitigating an exposure and setting a smooth course with the regulators when they get to a pollution incident. So their experience has been increasing, and the number of incidents they've been seeing and dealing with, and I think that gives the underwriters and the claims teams in the insurance markets confidence.
I think we lost you there, Alan, for a bit. But yeah, I think you make very good points. So Richard, over to you. Alan quite rightly points out the influence of loss adjusters. In the last one, we did, however, point out that this wasn't always the case. Not that the loss adjusters went right, but we didn't necessarily set it off by getting the right people involved at the right time. Has that improved in the last 10 years? And actually, has it still got a little bit of a way to go to make sure we get that first appointment right?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Yeah, I certainly agree with what Alan was just saying. The claims arising from the operational side of things has certainly been where we have seen the majority of the increase arise. Certainly, environmental claims generally have become higher profile over the last 10 years, and the reputational damage, both on a small scale, can be embarrassing, but on a corporate level can be catastrophic. I think the degree of knowledge in the insurance market is greater now. There's been the development of specialist teams, both to manage the claims or to manage the claims both with insurers and with the likes of ourselves as adjusters. Certainly the changes that we've seen over the last sort of 5 years, I suppose, 5 to 6 years, has been the sort of lower frequency of domestic oil spills, but higher severity. We put that down to a number of factors, but certainly the number of single-skinned oil storage tanks has decreased, and therefore the number of or the proportion of claims arising from external spills from tanks is lower than what it was, and therefore we get a greater proportion of higher cost and higher severity internal spills, so spills affecting buildings directly, which are usually more complex and costly to deal with. But overall, certainly we've seen a massive change in terms of the legislation in the market, regulations. We've had a recent change of guidelines from the Environment Agency in terms of assessing risks following a pollution incident. Previously, it was solely risk-based, so you addressed the risk to the receptor and reduced it to an acceptable level, whereas the recent guidance would suggest that there's a requirement to restore a site to its pre-incident condition. So lots of changes going on. It's a constant rather than what has happened previously. It's happening pretty relentlessly, and it takes a lot of time and effort and research to stay on top of things. I think you're on mute, Alan.
Always somebody does the mute thing first. Why does it have to be me? Neil, what Richard and Alan says both interesting, but from the, for want of a better expression, from at the fixing and do it end of all of this, in the last 10 years, have the instructions become easier, and have the solutions become more consistent? And I think Richard probably inferred a little bit of this. Sometimes it's not always clear where we're going with it and what the policy might or might not do. So how easy is it at the doing end to see what's changed and see what still has to change yet?
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for having me back on again. Things have changed quite a bit over the 10 years, as the others have been saying. I think probably the biggest difference is it isn't. It's not a new industry anymore. I mean, it wasn't that new 10 years ago, but now it is quite a mature industry. I think probably one of the biggest problems for us is that everybody's got Google. So now everybody is an expert in environmental claims, particularly all the customers. And there are more people, I think the others have alluded to it, there are more people involved now. There are specialist adjusters. So maybe 10 and certainly 15 years ago, we were basically regarded as the sole professional in many ways, and we were able to, people acted on exactly what we said. That is quite different now. There are more people making the decisions. I wouldn't necessarily say that always makes it easier, or it doesn't make it easier for us. We've obviously got to make sure we have a very compelling case for what we're going to be doing. But there are lots more questions now from both adjusters and insurers. And yes, the legislation's changed a bit over the years. That is true. We have, I think, probably the thing that impacts us the most, which we can discuss a bit later, maybe is the environmental permitting. Interestingly, it impacts on us the most. Richard mentioned the LCIM, the new guidelines. There is a strange clause right at the beginning in there. I think I'd be interested to know what Aidan actually thinks about that later on, about the sort of the removal of risk. But generally, I think it's the biggest change is the greater awareness. People know more now. You've got the bigger fines, and people are more aware of taking care of what they're storing on site, and so that has quite an impact in the way we have to respond.
Okay, it's interesting. Right, Aidan, back. That's where it is when we're trying to deal with claims from their view. From your view, there's two things that I'd be interested in looking over the advancement in the last 10 years and what's most impacted it from a theoretical point of view. But then actually from a practicality point of view, so there might be what we all know we should do, but practically, are we still doing it, or are there too many problems around?
Okay, well, Thank you, Alan, and hi everyone. Yeah, I mean, from a legal point of view, I agree with a lot of what's been said already. We've got, the move over towards more operational policies. There's certainly more of that, and certainly more specialist personnel knocking around these sorts of claims than at any time before. I guess looking back over the last 10 years, though, I think about 10 years ago, we did have a sense that environmental claims might be on the way out. A lot of litigation costs rules changed in 2013, and we thought, oh, that's going to be the end of environmental claims, or at least quite as many. And indeed, I think the highly speculative claims did drop away, but there's certainly been no shortage of claims. And indeed, the more speculative environmental claims that are being brought now are being brought by firms of solicitors on a multinational basis, where the UK is now being used as the venue of choice for bringing big international claims against parent companies based in the UK. So on the one hand, some kinds of claims have drifted, just aren't happening anymore. On the other hand, we've got some of these enormous international environmental claims being brought in England and Wales. I think another big thing that's changed over the last 10 years is really the size of fines that polluters and businesses and operators are subject to when they get it wrong now. Those have really gone through the roof over the last 10 years. So fines are very much larger. Civil sanctions are becoming very big indeed. A lot of people volunteer civil sanctions rather than go down the prosecution route. That's something that's changed over the last few years. And I think, as Neil said, environmental permitting has become very much more widespread amongst the business community, and regulators love using environmental permits now as a way to enforce the law, prosecute, and make people clean up. Perhaps as a result, I mean, these things, of course, are starting to make sort of environmental liabilities, if you like, a boardroom issue. And you've also got colliding with that at the same time, the whole rise of environmental, social and governance issues, ESG, which is, taking the corporate world by storm at the moment. I think, more and more investors want to know that environmental issues are properly understood by companies, by their investors. And, they especially want to know that they've sorted out the risks and opportunities from things like climate change. And as a result of that, I think, that's dragging sort of traditional pollution and liability issues up, along with it. And more attention is being paid to environmental liability issues at the sort of upper reaches of the corporate structure now, I think, than ever before. So those are the sorts of things that I think have happened over the last 10 years. I mean, in theory, I think people have known about a lot of this stuff for a very long time. Not very much has changed. From a practical point of view, I think that finally businesses are taking this very much more seriously now than they did 10 years ago.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. I guess this is the difference again between what begins to get enforced as well as what's coming in that's new, some stuff that begin to get enforced when it's older. So I guess to keep two questions in, starting again with you, Alan, how have we adapted to this and how we responded to it? We've touched on that with greater expertise. And in terms of the evolving legislation, how is that being implemented by the regulators? And we've just heard that, there's some increased attention from Maiden, but how is that affecting how you underwrite it and how you prepare to decide what should and shouldn't be covered, both domestically and commercially? I think you've done a me. You're still on mute, Alan. There you go.
There you go.
Remote becomes so apt to that.
Okay, so so firstly, what you're looking at is a company's operations, what they do, and obviously you ask the question about environmental permits, about waste management licenses, and you can ask them, or you can go to public sources to look at their compliance with it and whether they're being breached or not. But a lot of the businesses that we insure will not have environmental permits required, and therefore one has to take a look at the whole, or try and understand the ethos of the company, of the environmental management structures they have, their policy, how that's driven down. And often, you can pick up on that by looking at liability reports, engineering reports, property reports done for casualty or property placement, and get a good feeling for what the company's doing. So really, as we've moved from this pre-existing to the operational cover, we've looked to change the way we underwrite, and we look to the ways the policies are structured and the ease of doing business. And going forward, we try and make it easier for brokers. We make the data requirements for it more akin to a casualty broking exercise than a classic environmental policy. So historically, it was always very data intensive, and now we try and understand what the company does, because we're looking at it from a different angle. So it's understanding what they do, how they manage their risks, what certifications they have, and their reputation. Really, you can pick that up from the internet as well.
I think that's interesting. It is clear to take a look. But Richard, turn back to you when you get this. And I think you've picked this up from the previous ones. It's quite a clear view there from Alan and what they want to do. But I guess the problem when you're acting on behalf of different clients and you're looking at the influence of regulators, there's quite a few things to take into account there, along with what we said. So, you've got to see how you're reacting. Is there a consistent approach across the industry? And secondly, at what stage do you find out that the regulators are perhaps being a little bit more forceful than they have been hitherto?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think in terms of the approach of the regulators, we tend to get involved more or less day one of a pollution incident. And what some insurers have been very good at is basically writing a pollution hotline telephone number into their policies. Certainly the environmental liability policies that we get involved with, and the policy holder, when they have an incident, have this telephone number, then they get through to the likes of me. I've taken a fair few calls after 9 o'clock on a Friday evening from a farmer or a business owner who's had a pollution incident, and it gives us the opportunity to be involved day one, give the right advice, and get the likes of Neil's teams involved to contain and mitigate, which is all crucial when you're dealing with a pollution incident. But in terms of the approach of regulators, the most obvious example would be the Environment Agency, who are the regulator in England responsible for protecting and maintaining controlled waters. They tend to take more of a back seat, I would say, than maybe they did previously. They can be very proactive at the outset, but as soon as they know that an insurer is involved and an insurer is likely to be funding the cleanup, their approach tends to be, right, okay, you get on with it and tell us what you're going to do or what you are doing. And they generally won't provide sign off on the works that are completed. They will just say something fairly, and Neil will probably back me up here, it's usually something fairly innocuous, like we don't have any objection to your findings, something along those lines, rather than we are signing this off as being a validated site. In terms of using the legislation, we had the Environmental Liability Directive that was incorporated into UK law in 2009 under the EDR. We've found that the regulators tend to rely on sort of more tried and tested legislation and regulations than that, sort of more reliant on sort of permitting regs that the others have mentioned, and also in some cases Environmental Protection Act and Water Resources Act, which have been around for a fair old while now. And certainly Aidan mentioned civil sanctions and enforcement undertaking offers. What we have found is that those enforcement undertakings have become very popular with regulators. It saves them the time, effort and cost of pursuing an enforcement, but those offers often provide environmental benefits that a fine wouldn't. And likewise, businesses tend to like them because they can proactively manage their exposure following an environmental incident and also minimise reputational damage. So enforcement undertakings have certainly become prominent in the field of environmental claims, and that can certainly be tricky for insurers who provide environmental liability cover, because an enforcement undertaking by its very nature is voluntary. It's not something that is being claimed as such by the regulator. So but having said that, those undertaking offers can include things such as remediation costs and compensating a party that has been damaged by a pollution incident. So it all gets very complicated, I would say, for insurers when we get involved in enforcement undertakings.
Okay, so I accept that it gets very complicated for everybody. So let me go back to the doing end again with Neil, because there are several environmental issues, I think, involved when you go to do something. There's the big ones when you're deciding cover, whether it's covered, whether it's not covered. What you, in terms of your insurance contractor, and Richard mentioned this earlier, are obliged to put right, are all the things that in an insurance contract they're obliged to put right, does that fit in with everything that the regulators and the legislation would say was right? Or is that another area which is very difficult for us all to sit and resolve sometimes?
I shouldn't get. We're not policy experts, so I shouldn't get too dragged into that. But there's quite often a disconnect between what we're being told is covered and the legislative side. I think that's only natural, really. The issue we have is that there's I'm going to be polite about the regulators, because they have a very difficult job to do, and they vary in technical ability like in any other industry. But sometimes when we're there's this idea from the regulator that we are there to do whatever is required, and that's simply not the case. We're there to do what's either covered by the customer's policy, or what that customer is willing to pay us to do in addition. The difficulty comes that the regulator will be saying they want a lot more done, and sometimes the customer's not sure whether it is covered or whether it will be covered under their policy, and maybe they haven't even been told by an adjuster or the insurance company whether it's covered at that point. And that's where it's very difficult, because we just want to get on and do the work. But as Richard said, the regulators they can sometimes be incredibly helpful at the beginning, or you can ask whether they're happy, for want of a better word, with what's being done, and you might just get still a letter. They often send you letters still, and it will simply say no further comment, which isn't necessarily particularly helpful. It might even say no further comment, and should they find anything wrong in the future, they won't hesitate to take further action. And you think, oh, thanks very much for this, like, working together, I think it says in their mission statement or something. So it's a balance. We work a lot with the regulators, and I think we can see they've possibly lost a lot of their technical staff through recent years as well, and that's made it more difficult. And so we try and work with them as best we can and explain what we think is what is covered and what else might need to be done. Practically, the regulators understand as well sometimes that as Richard said, the insurance company will cover costs, so it's actually better to target what's actually covered under their policy sometimes and what's not. Okay,
I think that's interesting, but Aidan, perhaps you can help clarify some of that. But also, I think we got there was, is there a disconnect sometimes between what's covered and what legislatively should be allowed in the environmental issues? And secondly, taking a look further than that, what if we discover something, but the environmental responsibility might lie somewhere else for it, or maybe about to impact a neighbouring property? So where does this all lie with, one, the impact and insurance from a liability and the legislative perspective, but also in the, I don't know whether you would call it the moral responsibility or expectations to what would happen in surrounding properties?
Okay, well, I mean, that what you've just asked there is a sort of a separate issue. But just to start, if I may, I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said already about the way the regulators go about things. I mean, as Richard says, they do like to use the traditional enforcement methods rather than any newer ones, and they've been around for a long time. And people like the Environment Agency, they're in a position of huge power, and they know it. So even though they've got fewer people working for them these days, what they do know is that, you know, if they're dealing with a site that's got an environmental permit, they know that they're in a huge position of power. They can make you do anything you want. And what they like to see is people sort of running around, sort of doing the work for them. They're very happy to leave people to get on with things, but knowing that they are in this position of great power, and that's what I'm used to seeing, and I think that's what Richard and Neil are saying as well. I'd say that what they have really embraced at the moment is civil sanctions. They love civil sanctions for similar sorts of reasons, because especially what are called enforcement undertakings, they love it when polluters or operators and the consultants that support them offer these enforcement undertakings, because it means that things, the environment has some money spent on it, things get cleaned up, often some wider initiatives are pursued, and the Environment Agency doesn't really need to do very much in order to secure those gains. So that's what I'm seeing, that the people like the Environment Agency love these enforcement undertakings, or they do at the moment, and seem to be getting a lot more out of businesses and a lot more out of polluters than they would if they were to go through more traditional enforcement channels. So they quite like that. Now, you asked a question, Alan, about, you know, what happens if you get halfway through the sort of the remediation process, or the investigation process, and you find that things are a lot worse, if you like, than you thought they were. I would say that's something to do with the incident that you've been investigating. Well, unfortunately, you must just deal with it. But occasionally you might find that you discover something that is totally unrelated to the incident that's taken place. I mean, that might happen. You're investigating one kind of pollution, and you're digging down and you're testing groundwater and that sort of thing, and you find something completely different, something that's got nothing to do with what your client's done, but nevertheless, it's something that is a real problem. Well, in those sorts of situations, there's no one easy answer to that. But the best thing to do, I'd say, you should certainly think about reporting that to the Environment Agency, because quite apart from anything else, or reporting it to the regulator that's involved, because quite apart from anything else, if you know that it's got nothing to do with you, it will have the effect of widening the pool of people who might be responsible. It might make things more complicated, but it might also mean that the costs of everything are shared, and that the publicity costs as well are shared. So if you find something like that, if you find something unusual, but it was down to you or your client, the best thing to do is to get that all sorted out, get it out early and get it all sorted out. But if it had nothing to do with you or your client, then seriously think about mentioning that to the regulator in order to defray some of the attention, the financial attention, the publicity attention that would otherwise be heaped on you, sort of your clients solely.
So a very clear explanation. Thank you very much for that, because that's an area that we have visited slightly before. I certainly have a clearer view after that, Aidan. Thanks. Back to you, Alan. EIL coverage has been a response, as we know. What are the key differences between an EIL policy and the more standard forms of liability policies?
There you go.
This is done it twice.
I know. Well, I don't want to disturb anyone else as they're talking. It's quite interesting. Aidan's an example there about finding something unforeseen when you're doing remediation. Probably illustrates one of the key differences and benefits maybe of having, or probably of having an environmental insurance policy. Rather than relying on protecting yourself as a company against pollution risks solely on the back of a casualty policy which offers sudden and accidental pollution give back in an exclusion, which is always difficult to explain and very hard to rely on for a commercial business, really. And the key things around that of what an environmental insurance policy offers is the gradual pollution that occurs over time, or a reoccurring event, or something that's not noticed because of ongoing wear and tear of assets, as well as the first party, the own site cleanup. So if your neighbour has been redeveloping their site or doing any groundworks and has identified contaminants migrating from your site into their site, the regulators will get involved, and their objective will be to remove the source of pollution, which means going back to your site, to the insured site, and doing some cleanup at that property. And anecdotally, we believe as a market that around 70% of the claims we pay for environmental pollution are for that first party, the own site cleanup with source removal. And I think Alan and Neil would agree with me that about removal of source being one of the key requirements for the regulators. And the third aspect of it is damage to environmental damage to non-owned flora, fauna and habitats, or what other people may call biodiversity damage. And casualty policies do not cover this type of damage in any way, shape or form. So if the regulators do go down the route of environmental damage regulations, which they do on occasions, we're certainly aware of a very large incident 2 years ago, which was dealt with through the environmental damage regulations because it affected woodlands and affected a river. And that is the key, will not be covered unless they're having an environmental insurance policy. The other factors I think we like to point out to businesses, going back to I think of Richard's comment about the emergency response, that I think the markets now all generally have tied in with specialist loss adjusters or spill responders, and to get that number out to their clients immediately and be able to respond immediately. So what I always see is the benefits of the policy, it's a unique first party and third party product. As well as doing the first party cleanup, it will also look at first party business interruption and crisis management. And just going back to that thought of finding something, an incident has occurred, be it a failure of a tank, and the spill responders and the loss adjusters are already on site dealing with the regulators. As they're digging up material, tracing it back, they find some other contamination, and that may often have been there for quite a long time, be historical or pre-existing contamination, something that's been there over a period that obviously is not sudden and accidental, and then the insured faces this quandary or this potential problem of trying to get cover for environment for the pollution liabilities from a casualty policy and or an environmental policy. Whereas if they have the environmental policy, it will be wrapped up and it can deal with the gradual and the sudden and accidental. So I thought that was an interesting example that we discussed.
Yeah, I think it's all pretty interesting. So what happens when it hits you, Richard, and we have, we might have an EIL policy in place, but we still come across some of these areas which just make it a little bit more complex. And I'm going to make an assumption, the minute that comes in, does it begin to be more difficult to keep the pace of the progress of the process? So you have to talk to regulators and other people while there's a very important issue going on, of which speed is obviously clearly of the essence. How big an impact does that have on it?
Well, it is a huge impact, and the best thing I can do in terms of bringing out the differences between an EIL policy and a more standard form of liability policy. I mean, Alan's just done an excellent job explaining the differences, but from an adjuster's point of view, I mean, I was on a case just the other week at a commercial garage involved in fuel sales and vehicle servicing and repairs, and the Environment Agency knocked on their door because they'd had reports of black oil in the river just 100 metres away and down gradient from the garage, and they traced the source back as being a very gradual drip, drip, drip of black oil from a waste oil tank at the garage that eventually reached a drain, and the drain took it into the river. This was a standard property owner's liability policy that the garage had. So we had a number of aspects here. We had the Environment Agency and their time and expense that they'd be looking to recharge, not covered because it's a statutory charge. It's not damages per the operative clause of the policy. There was the cleanup of the watercourse, which again would be a statutory liability, and the restoration of any damaged habitats, which Alan mentioned, and of course the classic source removal. You had a fairly large plume of contamination on the garage site that needed to be basically removed and disposed of and made good in order to prevent any further contaminants from migrating off down towards the river. And on top of all of that, you had a claim by a landowner through which the drain was running, contaminating its soils. So you had a non-sudden identifiable incident. It didn't happen at a specific time and place. So not only were all of the things that the EA were looking for not covered, there wasn't even cover for the claim for damages from the landowner because it wasn't a sudden identifiable incident. So, yeah, managing that type of incident from day one when you know there isn't likely to be cover, it's all about sort of giving the customer the best advice and the best support you can as an adjuster, knowing full well that they're unlikely to be paid for any of it.
Mm. Yes, and these are challenging instances, which, whenever they come to publicity, don't even reflect particularly well on the people who are making the right decisions anyway, because it's a tough area. So, Neil, I'm going to phrase this as a policy question to you, knowing you're not a policy expert at all. But again, at the end of coming out and fixing, making this all right again, what are the aspects, what do you think are the key aspects that should be considered in terms of environmental liability policy coverage, or where are the holes? Because the holes might not be able to be covered from a purely commercial sense. But when you're completing the works, when you're trying to put this all right, what are the things you discover which cause hold-ups, and will cause Richard hold-ups that has to go back to the insurer again?
Well, building up on pretty much on what, in fact, what Alan and Richard both said, actually, the problem is when we're first there, you're not necessarily, or nobody's that certain maybe what cover there will be. that creates a major problem for us because we certainly can't guarantee that we're going to be paid by an insurer. And in most cases, unlike domestic, in most of or an awful lot of the commercial claims that we deal with, we're instructed by the adjuster that we'll be paid, or we need to be paid by the operator, and then the operator will in many cases recover the costs from their insurer. That, when responding to a job, is quite troublesome because not in all cases, but in most cases, we don't know what the operator or who that company is. So you can be called out any time of day or night. Easter bank holidays is a popular one. And you'll go out, and it might be a recycling centre on the edge of a recycling yard, quite a topical one for having fires. And they'll have had a fire, they'll have had a release from a number of plastic IPCs, which they shouldn't have been storing stuff in. Anyway, it's all gone into the canal, and it's Mr. and Mrs. whatever recycling, they're your client. They'll be recovering it from the insurer. Well, that's a massive problem for us because we don't know who they are. We don't know whether they've actually got, whether they're a profitable business. We don't know whether they're going to be able to pay the bills. And from our own experience, within 2 or 3 days, they sometimes put their businesses into administration because they're just trying to protect everything they own. So it's a real challenging situation. It was overcome with sort of the tanker fleets years ago, and I think it's something that maybe we need to work on. We almost need to know who these businesses are that are being insured at an earlier stage. I mean, it must be an incredible job for people like Alan to do to try and cover some of these businesses. The complexity of what they're storing, their sort of their primary containment, their tertiary containment, what's going to happen with the drainage when they have a spill. All these things, you sort of need to know, I would have thought, to be able to provide any insurance cover for them. And we're turning up at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and quite often there isn't much information about drainage. There's no real understanding of fire water, where if you've got a reasonable sized property and there's 3 fire engines in attendance, they're pumping a phenomenal amount of water into that. The operator of that site is responsible for where that runoff goes, and in many cases they have no plan in place. And it's I think there just needs to be, possibly when they're looking at these sort of insurance policies early on, then we all need to be working together to make sure we understand what the plan is for those type of events.
Can I just interrupt there? Sorry,
Sure.
just following directly on that. I think that's a real key benefit of the environment, of a lot, if not all, but many of the environmental insurance products is this offer of emergency response expenses, and it's something I think clients should take, and brokers should take on board to take a view on. How will they respond? Can they give the responders some comfort that the initial works will be covered immediately without much problems in the background in the claims team? And that's just not offered in a casualty program. And even when we're working as a company and we're providing both the normal casualty and we're adding the environmental as a wrap up and a wrap around, even then I'm telling the clients the key thing you're actually getting over and above the 3 areas which I mentioned as the main gaps is emergency response. We don't want that to get worse than it needs to be, and we will try and ensure and give the responders the confidence that initial works should be put to bed. Just do them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, I think response is good reputationally as well, given what happened. But Aidan, then at the back end of all of this, with the EIL coverage and the progress we're trying to make it, but the complications, when we get to the back end of this and it gets into a legal situation, are there shortfalls in the EIL coverage, or are these shortfalls that happen in the process not really down to the insurer but down to wider issues? And how often do you get into, I guess, what becomes pretty bad reputational stuff in the insurance industry? We could, I can liken this a little bit to business interruption in terms of people that don't understand insurance policies and what other people have taken out, and something is wrong environmentally and it goes to a court case. How can that look for the insurer?
Well, I mean, my experience of all of this, I mean, I agree with what Alan in particular has said about the shortcoming, and others have said about the shortcomings of general liability policies. And, you know, for all manner of reasons, environmental spills and incidents just don't get covered. As for environmental policies, you know, those have been very carefully crafted over the years in order to try and make sure that exactly the sorts of mainstream incidents that we're talking about here, the sort of the tank spills, the you know, the incidents, you know, from tankers on roads and that sort of thing, when things get released into the environment, those are exactly the sorts of things that these environmental policies are, you know, are geared towards covering. So they do cover things like your own site cleanup. They do cover things like, you know, Environment Agency mandated cleanup, and they aren't so keen, or it's not so absolutely critically important that a claim is brought before there is any cover under the policy. You know, they're put together with these sorts of incidents in mind. So in my experience, I mean, where things do go wrong, you know, the policies are perfectly able to cover environmental incidents. You know, where they don't cover the environmental incident is for something that's often completely understandable. You know, for example, it's a cleanup that costs £2 million, and there's only cover for the first £1 million. You know, so there's a £1 million shortfall. That could happen. It could be that the incident has been caused by somebody who's not actually covered under the insurance policy for some reason. It's an odd part of the group that's not covered by the policy. It could be that there has been some sort of misrepresentation made when the policy was taken out, as to the sort of business it was, the sort of claims and the sorts of claims that have been made against it. But that sort of thing is not a failing of the policy. That's usually a failure of the insured to sort of, you know, look after itself and provide the right information and get the right sort of cover. But it's not a failing of the policy itself. So no, in my experience, you know, environmental policies are quite carefully drafted to do exactly what they say on the tin.
You know, sorry. I mean, we should, you know, and it is a complex issue, and of course, it's an ever-changing issue as well. So as we approach the end of this, I want to briefly ask all four of you, when you take a look, if that change is constant, what are the risks and developments that do you see emerging over the next 5 years as the whole environmental issue goes forward? Bearing in mind that the environmental agenda is only going to get bigger and louder. Alan, over to you first.
It certainly is, and the most obvious one to mention is PFOS and PFOA, which are complex organic compounds which have been used in firefighting products and in producing Teflon, so you know, waterproofing products and similar. And we're only now finding out what potential harm it can cause to persons if they're exposed to it, and the extent that that these compounds have escaped into the environment. And now, because of technological advances, that, you know, we can identify these contaminants down to parts per billion rather than parts per million or parts per thousands, and this idea of more people doing studies to show some causation for various problems. It's a very big issue in the States, and it's certainly coming over to the UK and Europe. And we're beginning to see some guidelines around the levels of these contaminants. That's really from a specifically engineering type, manufacturing type businesses. But I think on a broader level, things to look out for, which I'm not quite sure where they're going to go, but it's the broader liability exposure to ongoing air pollution, which certainly NGOs such as Client Earth are making a much more bigger issue that people need to take on. And there are certain organisations that cause or are part of the cause of air pollution, and it's going forward. I'm very interested in how they're going to be drawn into this liability chain. So I think there's a broader area rather than just the spills and historic pollution in the soil finally making its way to a receptor and causing the damage. I think that's going to be the mainstay of what we're insuring for a long time. But going forward, I think we have to look about what could be pulled into a pollution policy. And that's what I think underwriters always have to be aware of.
That's fascinating, Alan. I guess, Richard, you guys at Questgates are going to have to study even harder to remain as the big experts that you are over this. What are the risks and developments that you see emerging over the coming 5 years or so?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting what Alan was saying about the PFAS group of chemicals. I think I've seen them quoted as being the forever chemicals. In other words, they don't break down in the environment, and they just they stick around and cause harm to health and other receptors for many a year to come. So I think if that does become higher on the agenda within the UK regulatory framework, then we might be looking at increasing our limits of indemnity under our environmental liability policies, because these things will cost a huge amount to investigate and probably even more to actually remove and dispose of. I can't see many a landfill site accepting PFAS chemicals anytime soon on its site. But yeah, so certainly emerging contaminants insurers will always be aware of or wary of. On a more sort of lower scale or smaller scale, obviously we as a country, we still use a lot of oil for heating our homes. I think we will, with the government's green agenda, I think we'll see more and more alternative heat sources, so perhaps less escape of oil claims going forward. Aidan mentioned ESG, environmental, social and governance criteria that's used by investors to screen investments. It hasn't impacted the insurance claims arena yet, but I can see a time when businesses who are looking more closely at their environmental performance perhaps identify risks that they would wish to transfer by using an insurer or buying an insurance policy, which can always give rise to more claims, of course. Mentioned the new EA guidance to contamination or land contamination risk management. I can certainly see that being used by certain parts of the sector to their advantage, shall we say. But overall, I think with the way things are heading with ESG and the government's sort of green industrial revolution, I think we'll be continuing to work in a fast developing and growing area of claims work.
You know what, that teaches me, doesn't it? There was me wondering if the experts and Richard and the Questgates team might have some new stuff to look at, and they're so far ahead of the game, they're already looking at it and taking that agenda forward. So that's very reassuring, I have to say. Neil, from your perspective, what do you see changing over the next 5 years? How do you see it developing?
Well, some of it's already been said. I mean, PFAS is certainly a really interesting subject, but also we've got this, huge change in the UK. We are going sort of down the electrification route. So both heating and our transport's going to change. Whatever anybody thinks that's going to happen. That comes with huge knock-on effects. We're not going to need as many petrol stations as we have at the moment. That's going to be an enormous amount of decommissioning, some good, some bad. We still got problems with the previous sort of old filling stations that have been redeveloped that weren't remediated popular the first time around. That's all going to come into play. And then we've got the changing fuels, even not just electrification, where there's going to be a push on biofuels and synthetic fuels. All the aim is to sort of help the general environment in terms of emissions and greenhouse gases and that type of thing. But they are still going to react differently in the environment. So, biofuels, generally plant-based, they're going to be a much simpler chemical structure, so they will biodegrade probably. But what you'll find is they might biodegrade quicker. So in fact, when they hit a watercourse, they're going to take in much more oxygen than a traditional hydrocarbon would, and so you can have a much bigger impact in a shorter period of time. So from our point of view, it's, it could become quite fascinating because for the first time in a while, the contaminants are changing. Synthetic fuels, which are being pushed by people like Porsche, try and keep the combustion engine going. I mean, what are they going to be like? Synthetic fuels be released accidentally into the environment. So it could be an interesting time.
Gosh, amazing. Last word to you, Ed, and then looking at it from the legal perspective, I guess, what do you see are the risks and developments over the next 5 years?
Well, I can start by mentioning one thing, which isn't, I don't think, going to make any difference over the next 5 years, which is Brexit. I mean, no one's mentioned Brexit once yet, and of course, everybody knows that it's, that the sort of departure from the EU is now sort of, well entrenched. But from an environmental liability point of view, I mean, it's going to make a lot of difference to a lot of environmental laws over time, I think. From an environmental liability point of view, I don't think it's going to make very much difference at all, because a lot of our environmental liability law is not EU related. So we can, for a moment, put Brexit to one side for the next 5 years. I don't think it's going to make any difference to environmental liability. There's a huge number of things that are going to be changing over the next few years, and some of them have already been touched on. What I will touch on first, though, are the things that I mentioned right at the start, which is big international claims. So we're not talking about oil spills here in the UK. We're talking about oil spills all over the world. And those claims are being brought in London now, or in the UK, because that's where the parent company actually is based. And those claims are starting to get traction now. They're formally allowed to go ahead against, often very big multinational companies headquartered here. And the feature about these claims is that they often involve spills of some sort, but they also involve thousands, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of claims. So I think we might see a small, but certainly not insignificant number of these sorts of claims going forward. So Richard, Neil, and Alan had better, get their passports ready because, they may be headed out to look at an oil spill somewhere in the Middle East or something like that. The other things that I think will make a big difference, ESG, already been mentioned. That's going to be pushing boards to take environmental issues more and more seriously. And as part of the risk management process that will bring in, insurance could well become, environmental insurance could become more, more of a must-have amongst companies over the next few years. I think there's always the prospect of new risks coming to the fore. Probably the thing that will happen in 5 years' time is something that nothing that any of us could possibly have thought about now. But the things that are on my mind, a few years ago we had, for example, Japanese knotweed became the number one liability concern about 3 or 4 years ago. That came a bit out of left field. But as Alan says, we've got PFOS. That's going to be something that may start to become an issue over here. I think Richard mentioned that as well, and I agree with that. That's a typical sort of thing that could happen. As Neil said as well, these new technologies that we're all going to be engaged in, those could lead to some sort of claim. New fuels, new ways of doing things could lead to new liabilities. And just the act of decommissioning, whatever it is, if you think about it, decommissioning huge numbers of petrol filling stations and redeveloping them, right, that's brownfield land, potentially quite highly contaminated. There'll be insurance issues or insurance opportunities there for sure for the underwriters as those sites, come in for remediation and redevelopment. So there's an opportunity there. And I echo what Alan said as well. Things like liabilities relating to climate change and air pollution over the course, that is something that, that the wind is in the sails of claimant lawyers in relation to those two things at the moment, especially air pollution. And don't be surprised if corporations or organisations in the UK get dragged into the liability net for things they have or haven't done that have led to climate change related incidents or air pollution type incidents. So there's a whole load of things that could happen over the course of the next 5 years, and quite a few unknown unknowns as well, I'm sure. But anyway, that's my best stab.
Thank you, Ian. I think that's amazing. Guys, I just want to say thank you to all of you for doing this. This is an area which, we've got this series of 6 going on just now. I think it's going to go on more and more. We're going to be dealing with this at the ILC conference later in the year to some extent as well as part of the conference. And all this is done to demonstrate its complexity. Very good reaction, I think, from the industry to what is a moving situation. A very, very, very wide agenda, which I think that many of us would have thought was a wide agenda. Having listened to you guys has just become, I don't know the word for wider than wide, but that's where it's going. It's fascinating. Thank you to Aidan, to Richard, to Alan, and to Neil. That was the second in the series. The third one will be coming up in a couple of months in the environmental agriculture. If you have any questions for anybody on this, just drop me a note at alan@iloveclaims.com, and I'll try and answer what I can answer, which is probably how to spell somebody's name, and then I'll pass all the environmental questions on to any of the guys that's interested. Thank you very much. You've been listening to the webinar on the ILC Home and Commercial Series looking at environmental and agricultural claims. My name's Alan Suter. I'm the chair of ILC Home and Commercial. Again, a big thanks to our major sponsor Questgates and to our silver sponsor RSK Raw for the support. If you get any questions or suggestions connected to this subject, please just drop me a note at alan@iloveclaims.com. I'll be delighted to hear from you, and we look forward to speaking with you again in this series in the next webinar.